Good afternoon. My name is Chrissy Thornton, and I am the President and CEO of Associated Black Charities. Thank you so very much for joining us for the March Equity at Work webinar. We love the opportunity every month to convene with people who have expertise over certain topics to talk about what it means to navigate systems in workplaces that aren't necessarily built for Black professionals to succeed. Also, to educate our allies and those who are interested in becoming more inclusive in the workplace so that we can start to right-size the experiences for some professionals. So thank you for joining us today. We will be speaking together today about cultural engagement in leadership. We'll explore cultural engagement as a driver for equity, for innovation, and inclusive excellence in the workplace. So we're going to be talking about leadership practices that honor and elevate diverse cultural identities at work, and how those practices can foster connection, trust, and creativity. We have some experts with us today who are going to share their lived experience and talk to us about how leaders can cultivate environments where all team members feel seen, they feel heard, and feel valued. And so I am so honored today to welcome our panelists to the webinar and would ask that they join me on screen. Hello, hello, hello. We are so excited to have both Wayne and Danielle with us today. We're going to make sure that everyone gets to know not only your lived experience on this topic, but gets to know a little bit more about each of you individually. So at this time, we're going to ask you to come off mute and introduce yourselves and share with us not only your background, but why you feel that cultural engagement in leadership is essential in today's workplace. And we will start with Danielle.
Hi, thank you, Chrissy, and also Associated Black Charities for having me. I am Danielle Allen, the founder and CEO of the Cuthbert Group, where I lead strategic business consulting on business transformation, process optimization, and organizational effectiveness. I also serve as board member and vice president of educational planning with HLA of Maryland and the director of enterprise business and change transformation at Sinclair Broadcast Group. For me, cultural engagement in leadership and why does it matter? Cultural engagement in leadership is the intentional recognition and integration of diverse identities, experiences, and worldviews into leadership practices and decision making. It enables diversity of thought and holds space for our differences, which leads to richer dialogue and better business outcomes for our people and also for us personally. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to dive in. Wayne, love to hear more about you and your expertise.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Associated Black Charities, for this opportunity, as well as attendees for joining today. My name is Wayne Yan. I am the Associate Vice President of Equity and Special Initiatives at United Way of Central Maryland. In my role, I shepherd an equity, diversity, and inclusion journey for the organization. Equity and diversity and inclusion has been in my blood. It is something that has been a part of my journey even before there was a formalized name for it, going all the way back to my college years and having to really advocate for visibility among Black people in particular, but I am centered and overall by a focus on humanity and ensuring people do have access to opportunities. For my lens, cultural engagement is really about ensuring that a space is created for employees to feel heard, appreciated, they see value, their experiences are affirmed. It is a space in which equity is a consideration. And so recognizing that we need to intentionally include people, and that also recognizes that people enter spaces with different journeys and different lived experiences, and that organizations truly need to understand that to be best positioned to drive change and create a culture in which employees do feel that they have that sense of belonging and they can show up as themselves. And it's important because twofold, employees are making decisions about where they work based on an organization's values. It's those that are positioned to do that. I recognize that it is a privilege to make those types of decisions in that manner, but employees are in fact making decisions in that way. And so organizations would do themselves well to be mindful of that. And at the end of the day, centering an inclusive culture is great and really essential for an organization to embody that growth mindset.
Absolutely. So we are going to dive right in, but first let me acknowledge that at ABC, we are still talking about inclusion. We have stood 10 toes down on our mission work, and I'm excited to delve into this conversation and to see our webinar today so well attended, which tells me that other people still care about and are audacious enough to explore what it means to center and to amplify inclusion. So thank you for attending today. We'd love for you to participate actively, to use the chat function, to use the Q&A, to interact with one another and with our panelists, to ask questions, to share your lived experiences. So I think what we're really talking about today, as we reflect on cultural engagement from a leadership perspective, is creating psychological safety for the people who are in our workplaces. And so I want to go over some facts and get your feedback about this. This research says that organizations who have diversity of thought and leadership, diversity of perspective, are 35% more likely to outperform the organizations. And those leaders who value that type of leadership also outperform their peers. 60% of employees say today that they would leave a company that does not value them, their diversity, their individuality, the way they show up, what they believe in. So let's start right there. And when you hear those facts, what does that say to you about the state of the world and how I think people are best positioned for success at work? Either of you.
Way to go.
I think that for me, it says a few things. It does indicate, as we're saying, that those companies that recognize that this homogeneous sort of culture where you do not have different perspectives represented among your leadership teams, among your workforce, you truly are not positioned to be competitive in this global economy. We know part of these conversations about, sort of setting the business case for why we need to prioritize this work around operationalizing inclusion within organizations. But we have seen that if we do not really center this notion of wanting to assess the leadership, ensuring you don't have this lack of innovation, lack of future focus, and lack of thinking, lack of true sort of strategy, it does not bode well for an organization's success.
Yes. Any thoughts, Danielle?
Absolutely. So to dovetail off of what Wayne said, I mean, when employees are looking for more than just monetization, of course, you want to be compensated fairly, but you want to enjoy what you do. You want to feel like you're a part of the organization. So when you incorporate different cultural perspectives, it just gives more of a holistic opportunity for people to develop as themselves, not just in their specific profession. So that would be my take.
Absolutely. So the research also stated that cultural misunderstanding is a leading cause of interpersonal conflict and disengagement in workplaces, which blows my mind because I can think about my own experiences, right, where I feel like I've been culturally, racially, ethnically misunderstood at work. But there's this old, I think, vantage point that you should just go to work and do your job, do what the people tell you to do, and go home, right? Like that should not be where you're necessarily looking for acceptance or, to be personally valued or to be understood. But we're finding out that cultural misunderstanding is a leading cause of conflict. So how do we weigh that? Is that old school advice that's no longer relevant? Or, are we moving in a new direction with our expectations?
It's certainly no longer relevant. Cultural disengagement does stem from legacy systems, to your point, and it's systems that reward conformity and avoid discomfort, right? So when organizations fail to hold space for our differences, they limit our
Our authenticity.
authenticity of engagement and stifle diversity of thought, which weakens, the organization as a whole. It disrupts innovation, morale, and it, essentially erodes trust.
But what is the requirement for people to make that space? Like I know a lot of workplaces, there's a lot going on, right? Like you have to do the job, you have to do it well, you have to increase your skill set. And now as a leader, I'm expected as well to make space for cultural understanding, perhaps because there's only 3.2% of senior leadership roles in the United States that are held by Black people, that means the leadership roles are held by other than Black people, and we are now expecting them to find or to portray cultural understanding. How does that line up at work?
I think, as Danielle said, it's an outdated model to think that you can just show up in the workplace, put your head down, and not worry about your colleagues and their lived experiences. This is particularly if you're an organization that you need to center the humanity of your employees. These are not robots. These are human beings that are experiencing the world in very different ways. So again, not to keep going back to this notion, because it does in many respects reinforce some of what we're fighting against. But if you don't acknowledge an employee's humanity, they will in fact disengage. If you do not support that employee's growth, they will in fact disengage. If they do not see themselves in the fabric of the work, if they do not see a space for where they can truly grow, if they do not see that the organization, again, values them as people and human beings and how they are able to contribute, they will in fact disengage.
Yes, and it says that employees who feel culturally validated are more likely to be innovative, collaborative, and committed to the organizational goals. So that is the return on investment of honoring and making space for who people are. But let's talk about root causes, because we tend to gravitate back to structural racism as being the root cause for a whole lot of things. But the root causes of cultural disengagement are very, very interesting to read through. One, we've already mentioned, there's a lack of representation in the leadership roles. And so when there's lack of representation of different cultures, ethnicities, and ways that people show up, there tends to be a limited understanding and relationship within communities with whom you don't have membership. But there's also a limited understanding or exposure of diverse cultures, period. So why is that a thing? And what can we do about that?
Yeah,
Go
Danielle,
ahead, Lainey.
No, go ahead.
No, so for me, working in corporate America, right? You're already a minority in certain spaces. So I think learning how to navigate in those spaces while still being authentic to yourself, but also ensuring that you mentor, that you pull people up, that you continuously engage, you invite people to have a seat at the table, right? You allow their voice to shine. I think root cause is kind of what it is. It's up to us not to necessarily live in the legacy of that, but make a pathway forward for yourself and also for others as well. So if you reach a certain accolade, make sure you reach down so that you can educate someone and allow them the space or the platform to be able to elevate and create growth pathways for them to move forward.
You speak to the root cause. I think oftentimes people are afraid to get it wrong. And so as a result, they are moving a bit too, from my lens, a little bit too cautiously and not really opening themselves up to that learning journey and learning experience, which is what truly benefits us all. This is an imperfect process. We are an imperfect society, and organizations do need to be prepared and lean into this notion of risk. And we want things to feel good. We want to be able to pat ourselves on the back on, yay, us, we did well. But again, it is, if we were really working in spaces where we didn't have to contend with the societal issues that led to spaces in which people, particularly people of color, have already been sort of left behind in terms of access to growth opportunities. We need to contend with that. You need to be intentional about with how you do that, ensuring that the approaches do center this notion of providing each and every individual person what they need to be successful, but creating the systems in which to do that. But when you are centering, creating opportunities for each person to be successful, you account for the differences within communities that might have led to some of the unique needs.
I'm all over the place because you all are just inspiring me to think about my own experiences. And there's this concept of Eurocentric hierarchy and structures that are calling and have for generations called on people like us to assimilate, right? That is, this white supremacist notion of what professionalism is. And so I'm wondering, as we're asking leaders to make space for us to show up authentically, what is our definition of what authenticity is? And I'm trying to think about what mine is, because I code switch so much and have been indoctrinated into code switching. I'm not even certain how my showing up authentically would look in the workplace, right? Because I don't know if they want like cussing, line dancing, slang using Chrissy in the workplace. Where do we draw the line on what people should expect from us and what space, what parts of us they should make space for in the workplace, and what is just our persona that should not be in the workplace?
So I can start. I think a few areas. I would say you need to use your discernment, to be quite frank. I know for me, in the role that I have, I know that it sends a signal in the ways in which I show up. So it sounds simple, but when my hair is not like this, big and whatever, and big and curly, and I'll wear my hair like this into board meetings. I'll wear my hair like this. I might throw on, some pearls or anything like that. So it's the visual. I also, if I decide that, I want to wear my Marley twist down to my back, I'm not going to pin them up because they say to pin them up, it looks proper and neat. I will wear them down to my back. So that's simple ways in which, you show up from a visibility perspective from the visuals. But yes, you should have the ability to not feel that you have to conform to certain notions of what professionalism looks like in order to grow and advance in an organization. Granted, there is an organizational culture, and that reality exists. In a perfect world, we want to be able to just freely show up exactly like, bam, this is who I am. But we need to be mindful of that. But I will say, just from the standpoint, I know for this particular audience, it's centered towards Black folks. So I'm speaking directly as a Black person. I do think we also need to interrogate areas where anti-Blackness might show up in our area. And so that we're still affirming those notions of ourself. We're not really buying into those, sort of negative stereotypes about what it means to show up professionally. So if you do have someone that may use occasional slang, that too does not mean that they are not showing up authentically, because we are protective of what it means to show up. And so we might look sideways at that individual that is using a bit more slang or showing up in other ways. But we also need to interrogate our own sort of anti-Blackness sometimes and how it might show up in these spaces.
I say all the time that corporate culture gets to determine what professionalism means to their culture, but you as an individual gets to determine what professionalism means to you. And you also get to decide whether or not your values align with that of the culture that exists. But the conversation today is talking about how leaders who understand the value of making space for all types of people to show up in ways that they feel most, I think, authentic and comfortable, has dividends in the end. Let's talk a little bit about what environments that don't honor cultural engagement do for or to Black professionals. What's the impact on Black professionals that are working in cultures that don't value and make space for their humanity?
I would say in my experience, oftentimes Black professionals navigate under unspoken rules, right? Unaddressed bias, and in some environments, just strict cultural erasure, right? You're expected to conform and not just be yourself, which forces us to code switch, right? To your point, also self-silencing, giving the appearance that we're not wanting to give the appearance that we're difficult to work with, right? Or we're not easy to get along with just by being yourself. So without engagement, we're left unsupported. We're left without a community, underutilized. And it's unfortunate because when we do that, organizations miss the opportunity to receive critical insights and feedback, which would promote great leadership and diverse thinking that we have organically just by having different lived experiences that we can bring to organizations.
Wayne?
If organizations do really fail to culturally engage, be culturally responsive for Black professionals in the workplace in particular, it leads to limited growth opportunities. You will certainly see the data around tenure and potential turnover rates and what that looks like. It exacerbates inequities systemically. From a just interpersonal perspective, again, they will struggle internally with feelings of inferiority, those feelings of maybe imposter syndrome, feeling invisible and not, you know, feeling valued or seen. And, you know, those can have long-term implications on an employee's, you know, their well-being.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about what it should look like. Let's talk about some best practices. And I'll lead with you all to let you talk about some maybe that are working well in your own workplaces or in your work experience, or some that you would recommend. If I want to be a culturally engaged leader that is doing the things that we say need to be done, what does that look like?
From my standpoint, it looks like listening, prioritizing various mechanisms for collecting that feedback from your employees, understanding what the struggles might be, what the challenges are, and being open to what that might look like. Don't try to, you know, sort of button up issues and really water them down, in which the employees would then question and you know, trust is called into question. So, you know, internally we do a host of surveying with our employees. I shepherd a equity, diversity, and inclusion centric survey. We have a broader organizational satisfaction survey. We are intentional about if your leadership is positioned to lead town halls in a responsible way. Certainly, you know, our CEO is positioned to do that. So when we have town halls, he has led those and facilitated those. We also create opportunities for anonymous feedback. And what for our employees, it's also very important for them to see that action is in fact taking place. So where we look at data year to year, where are those areas for those, again, growth opportunities? They're also really recognizing, you know, applauding where we're doing well, but what are some meaningful opportunities for development?
Absolutely, to dovetail off of what Wayne just described. So listening is the very first tenet, right? If you're not well informed or keep an ear to the street, right, then you're not going to know what's going on. So leaders who are also empathetic and equity in their approaches, that intentionally hold space, right? Because you got to make change personally within yourself before you can, you know, project that outward, but hold space for cultural differences, right? And great leaders who do that, they start to ingrain this into the fabric of their organization by creating co- tiebacks to cultural competencies. I say that also to mean, when you think about satisfaction scores, if you're in healthcare, would be Press Ganey. If you're in other areas of business, it would be Net Promoter Score. Oftentimes, we are focused on what people externally think about us and not what our staff think internally. So, placing mechanisms to create those tiebacks makes culture, inclusion, and leadership a part of the company and the organization.
Yes.
And I would also say, again, recognizing when it's time to bring in the experts. If you don't have that expertise internally, also to Danielle's point about, you know, we have a tendency to talk about what the external viewpoint might be of our groups and not really looking internally. If you're able to bring in a sort of third-party consultant, which we too have done over the years, sometimes that person is or that entity is positioned to sort of bear the brunt of where the challenges and gaps might exist and look at it with a really fresh set of eyes. And so an organization that is open to what that result might be and really ready to take on, you know, this is what this assessment is showing, this is where we recognize these gaps are. And again, really leaning into this idea of, you know, these are our values, this is who we say we are as an organization, this is the culture we want to support for our employees, here's what it looks like. And bringing in a host of just the various diverse perspectives to really assess that as well.
I love all of those things. And it also says here that leaders should lead with curiosity and humility, recognizing their own biases and learning, being willing to learn from their team and their own lived experiences, and then including those team members in decision making. Because a lot of times the team members who have the diverse perspectives do not have the privilege of being part of the decision making function. And a lot of those perspectives are not included. And then there's one here that says celebrate culture all year. I love that because I get, I'm one of those people, and I've built my career mostly in white spaces, white dominated spaces. And I was never a big fan of like, oh, it's Black History Month, it's Juneteenth, it's, Cinco de Mayo, or, it's Pride Month. And making those like these one-off times to reflect, celebrate, and honor culture while negating the culture of the team at all other times during the year. Any thoughts about that, cultural celebrations at work, and who's responsible for lifting those up if they do happen?
You have to start somewhere. I am a big proponent of really meeting people where they are. And so if your workplace, for example, is one where you might not have a team that is evaluating and assessing inclusion strategies in a direct and meaningful way, you might not have the infrastructure to, build out all of those those components. A simple celebratory event, again, it is an education opportunity. It is a touch point. It is a way in which those can increase, those who are not part of that community can increase their own development and understanding. And so I'm not one that necessarily, shuns those. I recognize the pushback, however, from others. They're like, well, this little Black History Month celebration, we celebrated Asian American Pacific Islander Awareness Month. But what else, right? So it's a multi-pronged approach. Several things need to happen, but certainly acknowledging those diversity awareness celebrations and really being intentional about recognizing the differences and the uniqueness among your teams, that's a valuable and essential first entry level step.
But nothing about us without us. So please, if you are an ally and watching, don't do it on your own. Reach out to someone with the experience in that culture or community and have them offer some input, because you would be surprised at some of the missteps that happen when well-intentioned people try to celebrate something they're not familiar with, right? I want to talk about something that's in the chat and take us to this for a second. There's a comment that says that I find that Black professionals who don't feel seen at work, it leads to them clinging to other Black coworkers who feel the same way, which then may have its own negative impact as, others may feel threatened. I'd love to unpack that a little bit because I've seen that work both ways in the workplace in my experience, where I've certainly cleaved to other Black people when I could find them and when they were present. But I've also seen the system of Black people in workplaces kind of also being put in challenge positions of opposition against one another. So that doesn't always happen that way. I'm in a leadership program right now where within the first day of the leadership program, all of the Black people had come together and we found our key partners and found comfort in one another. And there were already some statements about how we had kind of clicked up, where people felt uncomfortable with that. What is your experience with that in the workplace? What do you think about that? Does it create a threat for progress in the workplace, or is it harmful for Black professionals to link up together?
No, I don't think that it's harmful at all. I think creating a sense of community is the first step in helping someone to feel comfortable, right? That's the whole point of this webinar today. So I don't think that there are any negatives to that. I think if you are a leader, so I'm speaking from the perspective of a leader, when you find yourself in that environment, it's up to you to be able to distill information. So if you find yourself in what could potentially be a negative situation, you want to be able to reframe that. You want to provide that person with opportunity so that there's connectivity to not just you personally, but also to the organization and its mission. So again, we want to make sure that we keep our business focused, but we also want people to feel comfortable to be able to come to you in those spaces. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. And I also think that it's something that if it potentially could be negative, that you can spin that and reframe it in a more positive way.
Mm-hmm.
So from the perspective of employees and requiring and needing support spaces, I am a proponent of creating those support spaces, curating it, being intentional about what that looks like. We do that in all areas of our lives, right? So I see it as a general positive. What I would say is if that is a space you are curating, recognizing some of the challenges with the perception of what that space might look like, you might want to be intentional about how you are managing that space and where that space is viewed and where how that space is elevated. If you're able to protect it in a way that it is not as obvious that that space exists, then at least not to the sort of broader community,
Powers that be, yeah.
you know, I would err on that direction because ultimately we need all the tools that we can put together in terms of a circle of support in the workplace to be successful and whatever that looks like. What you don't want to, because ultimately you still as an employee need to work with your colleagues, you need to create those spaces for connection and opportunity. And you, as long as you're still prioritizing that as the bottom line, there is space for both. But as a leader, if hopefully your leader is culturally responsive and has cultural competency, because there was this, why are all the Black kids sitting in the lunchroom from, you know, but if you look around, you might just have this group of just the Black kids, but if you broaden it out, what's happening at these other tables and why are we not asking about the composition of those other tables? And hopefully as a leader, you can broaden that out as well, because oftentimes, you know, we are put in positions where we have to justify our existence, justify our humanity, justify our spaces, justify the ways in which we show up. And, you know, culturally responsive leaders will hopefully recognize that there are different factors that different communities navigate. It's like understanding why a certain community might not utilize eye contact because, you know, in their space historically, if they do that, that it's a sign of it's a sign of actual disrespect. And so a culturally competent leader is able to factor all of that in. And you can tell the difference between something is exclusionary and creating harm to the culture. And if it's just based on there really isn't some understanding around why this space exists.
I'd love to hear some of your own lived experiences with cultural engagement at work or disengagement, if that's the case, where your culture has either been embraced or not embraced, erased, and how that has affected you as a professional or on your leadership journey, if you have any examples to share. And love for those who are watching to put your examples in the chat as well.
I have both. Early in my career, I unfortunately experienced organizations that were not culturally responsive. And, you know, one of led to me leaving the organization, making the choice to leave. There was a circumstance that happened and they did not support me. I was essentially accused of being too sensitive. It was my former life was in a different path altogether. And I unfortunately had to make that decision because it just, again, did not align and it was a risk, but it needed to be done because it was clear the organization wasn't really supporting me. I've had also just really positive instance where my ability to transition into the nonprofit sector was led by someone who, in my experience, affirmed all of what I brought to the table. And so I was able to package my experience in a way that made sense to that individual, came on board. They really, you know, valued me as an employee. They created space for me to show up as myself, created space for me to make mistakes. They gave that sort of direct feedback, and it allowed me and equipped me with the tools to grow in my leadership journey. And so when you do have spaces that do value development of emerging leaders, it can lead that person to better outcomes. And certainly I've become stronger at self-advocacy. It's led me to really the space in which I am now, as I consider myself to be an emerging executive, and certainly continuing that journey to grow and cultivate those skills. And to the earlier point about that, I embrace the lifting as we climb mindset, creating the pathway. And so the person that comes behind me doesn't have to experience quite some of the challenges that I experienced to reach the point that I am at now.
Very similar experience to Wayne. It was always, we love your ideas, but we want someone else to present them, right?
Mm.
We like what you have to offer, but not necessarily what it's packaged in, right? So I've had those experiences where, you know, again, leadership just didn't feel like it was the right person to convey the message. And then I've also had more engaged leadership that did welcome diversity of thought, that did welcome inclusion, and really did not care who was delivering the message. It's just the fact that this was right for business. So it became more of a strategic imperative. So when we were in environments where it was very disengaged, attrition was higher. So yes, that was an organization that I did leave, you know, and went somewhere else that, you know, showed more outward appreciation and recognition for, you know, not just the message, not just the solution, but who was offering the solution.
Yes. So I see in the chat, someone outlined a circumstance where there were two Black women at the workplace. One was in a supervisory capacity, and when they became friends, they were accused of offering preferential treatment. So now they have to hide their friendship. That just seems sad to me. You all and Wayne, you talked about being careful about our relationships with each other, and I think mindful, but that just seems like the opposite of authenticity. What do you think about that example that was shared?
It does. I won't run away from that. It does, right? So people are navigating realities with very different set of circumstances, and
Different rules.
it's not only different rules, but some people are positioned to take risks that others may not, right? And so that is something that I recognize, particularly in this work. We want everybody to be out front and be the champion and wear this t-shirt and say, I'm gonna lean into diversity, I'm gonna lean into equity, I'm gonna lean into representation. If you're positioned to do that, please do. I think that that's also a lot of pressure on leaders of color, Black in particular, that are in these spaces where they're elevated. So there are ways in which you could also, from my lens, there are different ways, if we're strategic and collaborative, that we can attack an issue. And so we need to be intentional about that strategy. And so as an organization, create that space for when people do feel comfortable and lean into that comfort, that it's there and it's not risk. But it still takes, we're conditioned by history. It still takes time, even if that culture is created, for you to trust that you can show up as yourself. And I've learned that even throughout my career journey, and I continue to apply it. I'm doing more and more. I mentioned I'm an introvert. I'm okay with being an introvert. Introversion has very negative connotations by some. I now am very open about the fact, because even as a Black woman, what does that mean when I'm not as vocal? What does that mean
You're
when
angry, yeah.
I'm very introspective, right? And so what does that mean? I have leaned into the notion that this is what I need to do, this is how I show up, right? This is what it is. So I allow for, I recognize for people, it does take time. So I wouldn't question authenticity right away. But I just acknowledge that people are navigating different experiences.
Absolutely. So we're going to have some leaders on here, and leaders of all different backgrounds, who need to do better, who need to be more inclusive, who need to practice more cultural engagement. And we can imagine that even a will to do so will come with some challenges, especially as you're trying to change whole cultures in workplaces, or change the dynamic of how you relate to members of your team. So a couple I want to bring up. The first one is really exciting to me to talk about. It's the fear of saying the wrong thing. Because even if you want to become more, I think, accepting, inclusive, and culturally engaged, a lot of leaders avoid engaging and talking about things like race or religion or values or belief systems because there may be not only misunderstanding, but a fear of offending. How can leaders navigate that fear of misstepping?
I would say they need to lean into the discomfort.
Mhm.
It's difficult. It is challenging. We take risks in other areas of the work of the organization. This is a space where um doing the same. If that means though, you want to be strategic in how you do that. So I go back to leaning on the experts, leaning in on if you do not feel that you are positioned to lead this in a responsible way, bring in someone else to partner with you to begin that journey. Bring in someone with levels of expertise. There are different resources available that depending on the organization and the level amount of resources that they have to dedicate to this, you just need to be intentional about bringing in others to help you where you can. Also, you know, I think someone else said it in the chat, and I agree 100%. You have to tie it to the organization's mission, values, and those overall, you know, who are we as an organization? What are the values that we stand for, and why beginning this conversation will reinforce um, our authentic journey and our authentically who we say we are and the work it is we're trying to do and the ways in which we carry out this work.
I love that. I think also too, as a leader, as I'm thinking about it, relationship building is so important. Like the basics of establishing trust and respect with the people on your team or your peers, because there are certain things you can say and positive intent will be assumed when there's a relationship, right? Like, so you can't be just nasty and harming me and then ask me about my hair or my family or my belief system, right? Like, I'm not going to receive that the same way. And so I think as leaders, we also have to commit to doing some of the baseline work to letting people know we care about them as humans and that we are supportive of them before we delve in. I've had so many, I would say mostly from older white male leaders who were not operating in my best interest, then performatively try to ask me about something cultural. And I did not receive that maybe as well as it was hoped. So I think relationships are also important. Danielle, oh, you have more, Winnie, to lean
I
in?
was just gonna say good intentions are not they're an excuse. Your
Oh
good intent does
no.
not negate impact at all. You need to, it goes back to doing the work. But I think sometimes in these spaces when the offense does occur, we lean too much into, oh, they didn't mean it, or oh, they had these good intentions. And what does that do to the person who was harmed? So
Right.
you really always need to address that harm as well. But we can't rely on this notion of good intentions and have that be excused for committing even as so-called unintentional bias, you know, even as that might, you know, be or your unintended impact, it still has an impact nonetheless.
Absolutely. Danielle, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this a challenge being lack of metrics, right? The fact that some of this work that we're talking about is hard to measure, especially if you're measuring it against business outcomes. And my question is always like, does it have to be measured against the business outcome, or is doing the right thing and doing the good thing just something we should be committed to? But how do we align those who see the workplace as being, like actions in the workplace being in the direction of outcomes and needing to measure whether or not the investment of time and effort is worth it versus what we look at is just like being, a good and decent leader and human being.
Absolutely. So I think it's a little bit of both. One, you want to capture, this is a business, so you got to remember at the end of the day, that's going to resonate with the people who make decisions at the top. So you want to be able to have those tiebacks and create connectivity. So some of the easiest things you can look at is your attrition rate, right? Why are people leaving, right? Are they leaving because of pay, job dissatisfaction, connectivity? You can also, again, I go back to your net promoter score, your satisfaction scores. So doing pulse surveys to understand where your employees are, what matters most to them, them, right, helps you curate learnings. It helps you curate environment. It helps you curate what you're going to celebrate, things of that nature. So I think creating KPIs, we look at it like it's a big thing, right? And we don't want to make it this, but it's very easy. It's literally already in practice. We're just literally putting a measure to the things that we're already doing.
Yes, absolutely. Now let's talk about, I think, how Black professionals can help foster change in their workplaces and organizations. Like we know what it feels like to be disincluded, to be not valued. We sometimes sit in those environments out of complacency or out of just the need to be sustained financially or, for other reasons. But if we are to be active in our own self-determination and be part of the solution, what does that look like? As a Black professional, what can I do to foster a better and more culturally engaged workplace? And/or is that my responsibility?
I think if you are a leader, even if you're not, actually, I'll take that back. I think it is your responsibility, just being a good human, right? As a leader, modeling authenticity, right? Mentoring others, being able to speak your truth boldly and affirmly, right? Also helps with being able to hold space for those differences. It creates a ripple effect, which reverberates at all levels within the organization. I think that's kind of grassroots where you start and then you grow from there, right? Sometimes in organizations, you don't know what you don't know. I know a lot of people said you call in the experts. Exactly. If you're in an environment and it's large and this is going to be a big endeavor, pay somebody to come in and walk you through the steps of how to properly install this change. So that's also going to be something that's super important as well, so that you get it right the first time.
I would say you need to decide if you want to be that agent of change. We saw through certainly 2020 and everything leading up to that, the onus was placed on Black people to lead. Did they necessarily want to? Did they feel positioned to? Did they feel protected in the ways in which what that meant by stepping out front? Um, not always, but they did it. Commend those folks that did it. If you stepped into roles like, even the role that I have now, you saw people that were being elevated in these ways. And so, if you, if I think it should be done in partnership, because it also, if you are the Black person expected to take the lead, what does that mean in terms of the unpaid labor you're now devoting to shift organizational culture when they could there that investment could be brought in to have someone, again, that expertise guide that. But if you do want to lean into that, and if you do want to be the change agent, I would say you can simply start with working with leadership teams to create a conversation. Again, start small. If it's a round table around a politically, well, not well, again, if you're positioned to lead that conversation, I would say responsibly, then take that on and start there. If your organization is such where you can begin to develop interest in starting a diversity council as a starting point, you can do that. So there are ways in which, and there are, you've got organizations like ABC that have the resources that can certainly help to equip you with just the baseline knowledge to get started if you want to be that agent of change. And I encourage you and support you to do that, but also be intentional about the ways in which where are you best positioned to influence? I believe very strongly in leaning on whatever passion or interest you are to be effective in that sense. And so maybe you're strong at writing. And so do you have a newsletter in which you could just begin a conversation around an article, an issue that you find of great importance, and then that starts. But there are ways in which you can start at manageable points. And then as the organization's muscle is built, or as that infrastructure is there, you can get bigger and bigger and bigger and bolder and all of that. But start small is what I would advise.
You know, it's always interesting as a Black professional to determine how vulnerable you want to be in these environments and how much of yourself it's safe to share, or that you even, like you said, choose to share, because, you know, we are not or should not be responsible for creating cultural engagement, or at least the interest. I think we can inform it. But as you said, like, to add that to the job description as something else that we have to take on is very interesting. I was in Philadelphia this past weekend with a conference with Jack and Jill of America, and we were at Temple University with a bunch of the teenagers, and a white man came over to me and said, "Well, what is this?" And I said, "Oh, it's a conference for teens." And he says, "Yeah, but what do you mean? Like, what is it?" And I said, "Oh, it's for mothers, you know, African American mothers who have children ages 2 to 19." And he was like, "Yeah, but who is it for?" And by the time I had said the fourth or fifth answer to his questions, I literally was like, it's for Black folks. Like, like, what else you need? I got so frustrated with his questioning, because it seemed to me like he was interrogating something more so than whatever, you know, I was answering. And I realized, like, Wayne, I'm gonna just tell you, I might not be the one to lead the cultural engagement change at work, because I get so frustrated with people, and I don't feel like it's necessarily, I always have to evaluate the intention of asking. And then also, like, I don't feel like it's my job to break things down to the lowest common denominator for something that you can see with your own eyes and all of that, right? Like, don't, so I am the antithesis to this movement you all are talking about. Like, don't ask me about my hair. Don't ask me what shows I watch. Don't ask me what I brought for lunch. Mind your business. I'm gonna keep my head down, do my job, and go home. But I appreciate the the guidance that you all are giving others.
It's very real, because it is very real. And it's valid, because people have to take responsibility for their own learning journey. Some lead and like to be that resource for those that are trying to learn and build, and say, talk to me, let me be your living, breathing example. And if that is what works for you and makes you feel that you're driving change, sure. But there is space for those that are like, nope, I am here to work. I am here to be intentional about driving change in a way that is strategic and makes sense for me. And I gave you the information. Now go ahead and do that additional deep dive to do that, so you can truly understand. But you know, yeah, in this work, you do have to, if you are in this work, you are leaning into the idea of creating space for different perspectives. You're leaning into the idea and recognizing that we all come from different lived experiences, and you need to create space to explore those differences, to, you know, drive change and create community across difference. Like, if you don't have the space to do that, and if organizations aren't intentional about in supporting those spaces where people that, I would have never met someone that is 60 years old and, you know, from Appalachia, as an example. But that interaction in the workplace, where all of these individuals do feel affirmed, does in fact lead to a culture of, you know, one that is more inclusive. Representation alone, we know, does not lead to change. You have to be intentional about those opportunities for inclusion and that strategy around including. You can't just, you know, represent your way out of issues. But once you are like, once that sort of multi-pronged approach and you embrace that, that to me is one of the drivers for improving organizational culture.
Absolutely. So we are winding down, and I want to give the two of you the opportunity to give some last remarks of advice, or how to navigate, or resources. But I want to close on my end by sharing what Black professionals who are leaders can do to help resolve the problem. Because one of the things that we want to do is we want to build more pipelines of executive leadership who is Black, right? Because we feel like when Black people get into these roles, they can begin to be the change that they want to see, and be part of the solution. So one of the things that this says is, I embrace identity as a strength. So don't feel pressured when you're in leadership and Black to assimilate. Your culture is a leadership asset, right? Like, you can pave the way for others. Mentor and within your own community and across others, because we have the same responsibility to make space for other cultures, identities, and ways that people show up. And then I love this one. It says, name injustice. And I think, you know, many of us are hesitant for the complacency to do this, but whenever you're able to, you want to use your position to advocate for justice, right? Because that's not only going to help you, it's going to build pathways for repair for people who come behind you and future generations as well. So with that, I would love to hear both of you kind of give some closing remarks, and we'll start with Danielle.
I would say the impetus is just beginning with cultural engagement at your level, embedding it into your hiring practices and performance, and also in your development systems. I mean, a hallmark of future forward leadership is involving holding space for others, supporting equity and advancement, and creating growth pathways so that people feel like, again, they're a part of the organization, they see a future, et cetera. And also including diverse thinking in your business strategy, right? If you know you've always grabbing from a pool of people, widen that pool of people, select people whose voices may not have been heard in the first two projects, right? So having people feel like they're really involved and connected to the business. And I would say at the end of the day, we all know that corporations kind of slap DEI sticker on something and say that they're doing it, but oftentimes you don't really see any executable call to action. So make sure that when you are labeling and branding, these diversity programs, that you are actually putting in toll gates so that you can see returns on, the programs that you're rolling out.
Yes, and before you go, Wayne, I just saw that there are two questions in the Q&A that we overlooked, so I want to make sure you might be able to address some of them in your remarks, but if not, I'll make space for them afterward. One is about starting the process of cultural involvement and harmony when the workplace uses the workload as an excuse not to address it, right? Like that there's not time, that there's too much work to do. And then the responsibility falls on few employees of color to organize anything. And then the other question is around the current climate in Washington, D.C. and how has that changed anything as we're navigating leadership around inclusion? And I'll turn it over to you. That was a lot.
There are several questions there. What I will say about the environment is, I would say what's most important as leaders, we see with some of this, just the erasure of contributions and, our very existence in some of these, from just the spirit of what they signal. But these executive orders do not impact who you are as an individual. Certainly as organizations, you're looking at what are the implications strategically, where the values are, what the risks are. So yes, there's a space for that leaders do need to, really determine from that perspective. So that's a separate piece and it needs to take place. But as a human being that's growing in your leadership journey or within your leadership journey, this is a part of who you are. The language, I think you might have said this, the language isn't going to change who you are. Like you can't run away from like watered down language. I'm going to attribute that to Christy. I think she might have said that at another session. And it's true. So the environment is the environment, but it doesn't change who you are as a leader.
Absolutely. And do you have, because I co-opted your moment, do you have any closing remarks?
I do. Develop your own leadership models. Don't look to these sort of antiquated models of leadership. I think it's very important to, create what you believe that should look like for you. We are in 2025 and the resources available to us, there are the traditional ways in which you could do that, but you can also find other areas of really growth and inspiration. But be intentional about creating those models of leadership and tapping into individuals strategically that fits with what it is you envision for yourself, and be clear on your why, and be open to deep introspection and thinking about the tools you need to be successful.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. We appreciate you sharing not only your expertise, but your personal lived experiences with us to help us navigate a lot of these things that we're navigating in workplaces. We may in the workplace think we're alone, but these opportunities to convene help us realize that other people are having similar experiences and we can navigate them together. Thank you all for joining ABC's Equity at Work, and I am hopeful that you will be able to join us next month where our topic is DEI fatigue. Addressing backlash and sustaining momentum. With that, I am Chrissy Thornton for Associated Black Charities. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Chrissy.